Vicarious liability is really tracking an economic relationship, and it's widely misunderstood within the midwifery world. It is an impediment for midwifery practice. The topic is, when in actuality it's not really an impediment. People think that if they're going to work with midwives, that they're going to become vicariously liable. That's not what vicarious liability is. Vicarious liability is basically, if I'm going to enter into the world of commerce and I'm going to start doing things, I'm responsible for the economic consequences if there's an act or omission. Well, there's no really logical difference. There's no logical difference between the idea of I'm doing it myself or I send someone else out to do it. Think about the idea of buying a truck and moving stuff around. I can do that. I can get behind the wheel and start doing that, and if I have an automobile accident, I'm responsible. But if I get an employee to take the same truck and the same stuff to move it around, I'm still responsible for what happened, because I'm getting the benefit of the economic commerce there, and I have the responsibility. So vicariously, I am doing various things out in the marketplace. So you will always have a vicarious liability link when you have an economic link, and you generally don't have a vicarious liability if there isn't an economic exchange. So a collaborative practice agreement for a physician doesn't create a vicarious liability for the physician over what the midwife has done, because they have separate roles, and in fact the collaborative practice agreement describes exactly what those separate roles are. They're each responsible to the patient for the process that they've engaged in. Whether the patient pays them or not, there's this premise that it is an economic relationship, there's a professional role. But they're not responsible for what the other professional does in their autonomous role. So if you have a birth that turns into the necessity of a C-section, the physician isn't responsible for the midwife's management up to the point that she says, or he says, we're going to transfer to the doctor. The midwife isn't responsible vicariously for how the C-section went unless they go into the OR and are part of that C-section process too. So vicarious liability is misunderstood in the sense that we think we're liable for a lot more than we really are. Now, you're always going to have vicarious liability when you have an employment relationship. So one midwife owns a birth center and employs 3 midwives. They're responsible, the birth center and the owner and the employer are responsible for the activities of all the midwives. So if you take that into the context of medical malpractice itself, the coverage for each individual midwife is also something that protects the economic interests of the employers. That's why you see a lot of, most employment contracts include a component of the employer being willing to pay for medical malpractice coverage. If there was no medical malpractice coverage for the employee midwife, then the employer and their policies that they have would take the entire economic brunt. And often these lawsuits involve a lawsuit against the midwife and then against the employer and possibly against the supervisor. So a practice is likely to want to buy a package of professional liability insurance that covers all those layers at the same time, knowing that one, you're going to have a united defense by the individuals, but also that you have this layered coverage process so that you have greater insurance coverage, essentially, and you can manage that, because the attorneys are always going to look for what is always called the deep pocket if they're in the business of a lawsuit. And you can't have a competition between the various midwives and the practice as though they're covered by different policies and different entities, because then you wind up with all the defendants fighting against each other for the benefit of where they lie in this liability strain, as opposed to a more united defense of this wasn't wrong, this was right, or this is the limit of what was wrong as defenses.